Iranians can match us at every point, and they can cause not only enormous damage for the countries in the region and for the United States military forces that are located there, but maybe even more importantly for the international economy. They have the ability, as you go up the escalation ladder, to tank the international economy. This would be catastrophic.
What is up, everybody? Norveda here. And listen, I need you to pay very close attention to what you are about to watch, because this is not a pundit giving opinions. This is not a partisan talking head spinning a narrative. Professor John Mearsheimer is one of the most respected international relations scholars on the planet, the man who predicted this disaster before most people even knew where the Strait of Hormuz was on a map. And he just sat down with Piers Morgan and laid out in cold, clinical detail exactly how Donald Trump walked America into a catastrophic trap with no exit strategy, no plan, and no way out. That does not look like a humiliating defeat. And the part that should make every American's blood boil, the man who engineered this entire situation has been trying to find a president dumb enough to do it for 40 years. He finally found his guy. This clip is a few weeks old, but I am bringing it to you today because every single word in it is more relevant right now than the day it was recorded. Hit that like button, subscribe to Norveda's Take, and let's get into it.
Well, we begin today's coverage with Professor John Mearsheimer, a regular visitor to Uncensored, who's written and spoken about all of this for decades. Professor Mearsheimer, welcome back to Uncensored.
I'm glad to be here, Piers, and I'm glad to see that you've recovered from your fall.
Thank you. Nearly there, nearly there. Back in the studio, down to one crutch, and life goes on, thankfully. Let me just ask you straight off the top. A lot of people on the sort of vehemently pro-Israeli side tend to say, why do you keep making this about Israel? Why do you keep talking about Israel? When they themselves constantly talk about Israel, and from my perspective, often try and silence legitimate debate about Netanyahu's government and what they're up to by branding people who criticize it in any way anti-Semitic and so on. You can't escape the Israeli influence, not least in this war in Iran, right?
I think that Israeli influence and the Israel lobby's influence in leading the United States into this war is quite obvious. There's just an abundance of evidence that Israel pushed us into this war and that the lobby helped. And of course, whenever that happens and somebody points it out, that person is accused of being an anti-Semite or a self-hating Jew. But this is ridiculous. The question is whether the evidence supports the claim or not. And the debate should be fought over the evidence, not devolved to name calling, which of course exactly is what is happening here. But the fact is, Piers, there's overwhelming evidence that the lobby and Israel itself helped in a major way to push the United States into this war.
Well, we just have to take Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, at his own word before he was persuaded that he hadn't said what he'd said, because he said it on camera. And he said that when asked why did America have to preemptively strike at Iran, he said because America had been notified by another country, clearly Israel, that they were going to attack Iran, and that the inevitable consequence would be that Iran would respond against American interests, including military bases in the Gulf and so on. And therefore, America had to get in first and preemptively go in with the Israelis. It seemed at the time very convoluted, but very revealing too, because as we now know from Antony Blinken, I've talked about this many times on the show since he said it, because it's so relevant, I think, Netanyahu had tried to do this with both Presidents Obama and Biden. He'd said, look, I'm going to attack Iran. Are you with me or not? And they both said no. And then he didn't attack Iran. And so there are many who do believe that Netanyahu, we saw Trump, I think, 8 times in the run-up to this war, that he basically bamboozled, maybe not bamboozled, but forcefully persuaded Trump that he was A, going to do this, and B, America had to be with the Israelis.
Yeah, I think it's not only Secretary of State Rubio who said that, but the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, said it. And furthermore, Lindsey Graham, who is a super supporter of Israel, has said that he worked hard with with Prime Minister Netanyahu to give Netanyahu advice on how to convince President Trump to attack Iran. So you see all sorts of evidence of Netanyahu's fingerprints on this war.
We're now at a stage in this war where thousands of Marines have now been dispatched to the conflict zone. The Iranians, who must know they can't compete with the Americans and Israelis with their combined military firepower in the air or at sea or anywhere else, frankly, militarily, but they can compete in this strategic economic way. Do you agree with that?
Sure. I mean, I think what's going on here, Piers, is that the United States and Israel thought that we could win a quick and decisive victory, either by decapitating the regime or some form of shock and awe campaign for the first few days of the war. And the Iranians would then throw up their hands and they would submit to our demands. And in fact, President Trump has said that he was told that there was a good chance that the Iranians would close down the Strait of Hormuz, but he ignored that warning because he thought we would win a victory before that became a viable option for the Iranians. But what's happened here is that we did not achieve a quick and decisive victory, and we're now in a long war, a war of attrition. And that's a war that the Iranians prepared for, and that's a war that the Iranians are in an excellent position to prevail in. If you think about the various steps up the escalation ladder that we can take, what you see is that the Iranians can match us at every point, and they can cause not only enormous damage for the countries in the region and for the United States military forces that are located there, but maybe even more importantly for the international economy. They have the ability, as you go up the escalation ladder, to tank the international economy. This would be catastrophic. So we are now in a situation, having failed to achieve a quick and decisive victory, where we could lose in a really serious way.
So if you were advising Donald Trump, which is, I have to say, at the unlikely end of the expectation ladder, but if you were, what advice would you give him? He clearly, I think, wants to get out of this, but he doesn't seem to really know how he can do that, which doesn't look like a crushing defeat or retreat. What would you advise him to do, which would be a skillful and achievable way of extricating America from this war?
I've thought long and hard about this, and I've talked to a number of very smart people, a number of my friends who are what I would call spinmeisters. They can figure out almost always how to get out of a mess. And I don't think anybody can come up with a good solution for solving this problem. What most people say is that what President Trump should do is declare victory and get out. I mean, he can do that, but it will be seen as a humiliating defeat for the United States. And furthermore, you run into the problem that the Iranians themselves might not agree to end the war. The United States can quit, but the Israelis and the Iranians may continue fighting. And again, as I said, the Iranians have a lot of cards to play here. They can do a lot of damage. So even if we walk away, it's not clear that that solves the problem. And then again, where I started, the United States will look like it suffered a humiliating defeat. So I think that President Trump has got himself into a situation where there is really no good exit strategy.
Yeah, that's the way I see it. And I'm still completely baffled why politically, never mind anything else, he thought this was a good time to take the biggest gamble he's ever taken, because he's got the midterms coming. You know, already he was looking like he might lose the House. He could lose the Senate over this. And then that's pretty much it. You know, as a president, if you don't have any control of any part of Congress, there's not much you can do. You can fly a few executive orders around, but otherwise you're extremely limited in your power. And of course, the other irony of this is that Russia is already emerging as one of the big beneficiaries of what is going on, because the sanctions have been lifted. They're making enormous amounts of money from this, which could carry on the longer it goes on. And you've got to look at it and say, how does a war you've launched against Iran that ends up with Russia benefiting with higher prices for its own stuff, degraded Western sanctions against it, and potential Chinese backing for new projects, how does any of that be a win for the United States?
Well, it's not. But to get to your initial point as to how he could have possibly got himself into this mess, I think it's very important to understand that he thought that the Iranian regime was very vulnerable. It was very weak.
Yeah.
And that the United States could cause it to topple with great ease. You want to remember that before the war, when we moved the Armada into the Middle East, Steve Witkoff has told us that President Trump was surprised that the Iranians did not throw up their hands and surrender before the war started. In other words, President Trump expected the mere threat of force from this armada to cause Iran to surrender. And of course, that didn't happen. And then he went to war thinking just a little bit of military force on the first few days. This wouldn't be a long war. We would knock off the regime. And I think that his success in Venezuela, where he was able to kidnap Maduro and put an end to that conflict very quickly, gave him additional confidence that he could, in a sense, float like a butterfly and sting like a bee. But the fact is that that didn't happen. And again, once that doesn't happen, he's in a catastrophic situation. But I don't think he thought for 1 second that that would happen. And again, that's why he could dismiss the Pentagon's warning that it was likely that the Iranians would shut down the strait. And furthermore, the warning that the Iranians would engage in horizontal escalation. They would not simply attack Israel, they would attack American assets in the Gulf, and they would attack the Gulf states themselves. He just didn't see this coming. But once it came, he's in a mess that I don't see how he gets out of.
Yeah, it's very difficult to see how he gets out of it easily, certainly. Professor Mearsheimer,
Let's talk about what
good to-
Mearsheimer actually laid out, because this was not commentary. This was a forensic autopsy of the most strategically reckless American military decision since Iraq. Delivered by someone with zero political agenda and 40 years of receipts, the core diagnosis is this. America went into this war expecting a quick, decisive victory. Shock and awe. Decapitate the regime, Iran folds, Trump takes a victory lap. That was the plan from these absolute morons in the administration, and it failed completely. Instead, America is now stuck in a war of attrition against a country that spent decades building its entire strategic posture around making exactly this kind of war unbearable for whoever started it. Iran did not close the Strait of Hormuz by accident. They had a playbook. They knew this day might come, and they were ready. And here's the part that should make every American furious. Trump was warned. The Pentagon told him Iran would close the strait. He ignored it. He was warned about horizontal escalation, that Iran would hit American military assets across the Gulf, not just Israel. He ignored that too. Steve Witkoff confirmed that Trump was genuinely surprised when Iran did not surrender at the sight of the American Armada. Surprised, the President of the United States was surprised that a sovereign nation of 90 million people with a sophisticated military and a 40-year history of resisting American pressure did not immediately fold when he showed up with ships. That is the depth of strategic thinking that produced this war. And that is what is now costing American families real money at the pump and at the grocery store every single day. The exit strategy problem is where this becomes truly catastrophic. Mearsheimer said he thought long and hard about this with some of the smartest strategic minds he knows, people who can almost always find a diplomatic way out of a mess. Nobody could find a good solution. The best option on the table is declare victory and leave. And even that does not work because the Iranians may not agree to stop, because America still looks humiliated. And because Israel and Iran may keep fighting, regardless of what Washington decides, there is no clean exit. There is no version of this story where Trump comes out looking like the deal maker he promised to be. And that brings us to Netanyahu, because this needs to be on the record every single time this war is discussed. Benjamin Netanyahu has been trying to drag America into a war with Iran since the 1990s. He went to Obama? No. He went to Biden? No. Neither war happened. And then he found Trump, a man who thought Venezuela was a blueprint for regime change, who desperately wanted a foreign policy legacy, who was surrounded by people like Lindsey Graham, literally coaching Netanyahu on how to persuade him. Marco Rubio delivered the justification on Capitol Hill, and Trump, the America First president, who promised his voters no. New Wars became the first American president to give Netanyahu exactly what he wanted after 40 years of trying. The man who ran on ending endless wars started the most potentially catastrophic American military adventure since Iraq. For a foreign government's strategic interest, and while American families pay the price. And then there was Russia, sanctions lifted, oil revenue surging, Ukraine war funding replenished, China watching America drain military resources and diplomatic credibility in a region they have spent years carefully building influence in. Tell me how any single part of that is America first. You cannot, because it is not. It is Netanyahu first, and Mearsheimer said it. Rubio accidentally said it. Graham said it out loud to the Wall Street Journal. The quiet part has not been quiet for weeks. Here is what matters going into the midterms. This war was not authorized by Congress. It was not approved by allies. It has no exit strategy, according to the world's foremost experts. It is benefiting Russia and empowering China. It was justified by a rationale the Secretary of State himself accidentally debunked on Capitol Hill. And it was started for a foreign government that lobbied for it for 4 decades while American families pay the bill. Every single one of those facts needs to be in every ad, every conversation, every vote between now and November. Make them own every barrel of oil, every Marine deployment, every spike at the pump. This is Trump's war. He owns every consequence of it. Share this video, hit that subscribe button, and drop a comment below telling me where you are watching from. Norvada's Take exists to make sure the experts get heard and the people responsible get held accountable.